This week we're focusing on secondary sources. Now, to date you may have been focused primarily on primary sources, i.e. statutes and cases, because many of the tasks that you will have undertaken so far will have focused on problem questions where you're required to provide advice to someone in the problem question. But secondary sources are an invaluable resource when it comes to critiquing and analysing the law. Primary sources on their own are not sufficient in those circumstances. For example, a statute only tells us what the law is. It doesn't tell us how effective it is, whether there are issues with the regulation of the area or the enforcement of the area. It doesn't tell us what compliance rates are. It merely just sets out what the law is, and even then it's ambiguous sometimes. Cases, well, judges may resort to considering policy, human rights, and the practical implications of their decisions, but this normally only occurs at the appellate level, and that's because most of the lower courts are focused on applying the existing law to resolve and determine disputes. It's only at that appellate level where they are considering a change in the law or providing clarification on an ambiguous point that they might start to turn to those secondary sources. And even then, judges can only evaluate on the basis of what is presented to them in the hearing. And there are also evidential issues in presenting things. So statistics, for example, that may show why sentencing on the basis of deterrence is ineffective would be inadmissible in a courtroom. And that means that the court is often making decisions in a vacuum. Often there's a range of evidence and considerations that are not presented or at least not evaluated by the courts. So that's why law reform projects like this, which can consider a vast array of evidence that's not available to the courts, are essential to ensure that the law keeps up with or aligns with society's expectations. The great thing about the Law Reform Commission projects is that they can investigate the situation, look at all the evidence that the courts can't. They can consult with the public, which means that they get expertise, they get comments from experts who can tell them what the problems are and potential solutions to those problems. It's all outside the constraint of precedent and the rules of court, and so it's much more flexible and much more able to identify these wicked problems and then try and find suitable solutions to them. Now, when it comes to database searches, I want you to think very carefully about what search terms you are going to use when looking for secondary sources on point. So, for example, let's just say that you were looking for articles that have discussed or critiqued the law regarding the use of listening devices. If you search for listening and device, then any document that contains those two words would be pulled out of the database. And that means that even when those phrases don't appear together, so listening is not right next to device, it would still be picked up. So for example, it could actually be that the story in the text is something that person A wasn't listening, so that party picked up a mobile device. And that's where your listening and device comes from, and that's nothing to do with civil surveillance. So if you want to search for a particular phrase like that, and you want the words to appear together, you use double quotation marks around them. So double quotation marks around listening device. That would then only pull out where that specific phrase is found in a text. You can also use truncation, which is a star, so that you can search for variants of words. As the study guide notes, and there's a bit more information in there, if you put negligent and then a star, it would look for negligent and negligence. So that would provide you with a broader search, but of course you don't necessarily want to do that if you're trying to conduct a narrow, confined search. And the other point is, please don't use truncation like that within double quotation marks, because the double quotation marks are looking for a precise phrase, and then truncation looks for variations of words, and the two just aren't compatible. It gives the computer a headache. There are other conjunctions that you can use to narrow or expand your search, like or and not. So if you were wanting to look at duty of care, but not in relation to medical practice, you wanted to focus on duty of care in police, then you could write not medical or not doctors or something like that. And do you remember algebra at school? Well, there's a little bit of that in database searches too. So like maths, you can use brackets to ensure that information outside of the brackets is applied to the content in the brackets. So for example, if you wanted to look for duty of care in relation to both doctors and nurses, you don't need to do a duty of care doctor search and then a duty of care nurses search. You don't need to do two separate searches. You can search for duty of care brackets with nurse or doctor contained in the brackets. Okay, for this week's workshop, I'd like you to begin compiling a lit review. A literature review is basically a bibliography, so it lists all the sources you've found so far and provides a summary of information about each source. Now this is going to be really helpful when it comes to carefully planning your arguments before you start to write and during the writing process, because it's going to help you narrow down or identify what sources support particular points that you will make throughout your paper. Now, as I said, the literature review is basically a bibliography, but it does contain a summary of information. So what you want to note in your lit review is the key arguments made in the source. So not everything it says, but what are its primary arguments? You should try and identify the theories that underpin those arguments, and note some quotes that you may or may not use later on. That will definitely help you when it comes to writing later, because you might quote directly, you might summarize, or you might paraphrase, but make sure that when you take those notes, so when you're noting down the key arguments and when you're noting down those quotes, make sure you include the pinpoint reference to prevent you from having to reread it later when you start writing up your final project and then you realize that you need to provide a pinpoint reference for the use of someone else's idea. Once you've got a comprehensive overview of the sources you've found so far, it might be a good idea to start cross-referring them. So where does that particular article sit with other sources? Are you identifying a big, large stream of articles that suggest that the law should be X, or this is what's wrong with the law? And then are there some others, some outliers? So it helps you to understand the respective positions in academia, and that again will help you formulate your arguments. In terms of finding a theoretical background, Scott's video provides a really good example of how a theoretical perspective changes the content and the arguments that appear in a thesis. So in that video, it explores Oscar's law in more detail, which is focused on trying to ensure a ban on backyard breeding and puppy farms, providing rights to breed dogs only to licensed breeders who produce purebred dogs. Now, as Scott's video explores in more detail, an animal rights perspective would be very different to an economic perspective. So the economic perspective would focus on financial costs, the reduce in supply, i.e. of the number of dogs available. It would increase sales for professional breeders and possibly increase costs because of a reduction in supply. But there would be a financial impact on those who are not professional breeders. So you can see how that analysis is very different to one that would be focused on animal rights. You can look at a positivist approach as well. You know, how far does the law have to go to achieve particular policy aims? Is what we currently have in terms of anti-cruelty legislation sufficient to achieve the aims that are desired? So make sure you check out Scott's video to help you formulate a theoretical perspective for your paper. It will help shape your paper, and it will help you form your arguments as well.